The grand hearing chamber of the United States Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation was packed. Rows of cameras lined the back, flashing intermittently as reporters jotted down notes, waiting for what they knew would be a fiery confrontation. The air was tense, anticipation thick enough to cut with a knife. Seated at the center of the room was FAA Administrator Michael Reynolds, a Biden appointee, flanked by aides who whispered hurried last-minute notes into his ear. Across from him, Senator J.D. Vance, now the vice president under President Donald Trump, leaned back in his chair, flipping through a folder of documents with a knowing smirk. Vance, the man who had risen from a humble Ohio background to become one of the fiercest defenders of traditional American values, was ready for battle. Administrator Reynolds, Vance began, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs. Let's talk about the Federal Aviation Administration's new language policies. Reynolds cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat. Of course, Mr. Vice President. The FAA under the Biden administration worked to modernize aviation terminology to reflect a more inclusive and diverse workforce. These changes align with our commitment to fostering a workplace where Vance held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. I'm talking about the policy that removes terms like cockpit because it's supposedly gendered, replaces airmen with aviators, and gets rid of man-made because it's offensive. He arched an eyebrow. Am I getting that right? Reynolds hesitated. We are making updates to ensure that the FAA's language is welcoming to all individuals who wish to pursue careers in aviation. The room stirred. Vance let out a dry chuckle. Administrator Reynolds, do you think the average American pilot sitting in his cockpit, his flight deck, cares whether the terminology is welcoming? Or does he care about ensuring that his aircraft doesn't fall out of the sky? Laughter rippled through the room. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably but held his ground. We believe that fostering a culture of inclusivity encourages participation from historically underrepresented groups. Vance cut him off again. What does that have to do with making sure planes take off and land safely? What's more important, engineering and aviation safety or virtue signaling? Reynolds forced a smile, but Vance could see beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Vice President Vance, language matters. The way we structure our communication in aviation affects the perception of roles within the industry. We want to attract the best talent, including women, minorities, and LGBTQ+ individuals. Vance leaned forward. You mean to tell me that a qualified pilot or engineer, someone with the intelligence and discipline to operate a multi-million-dollar aircraft, won't join the aviation industry because the FAA uses the word cockpit? The chamber went dead silent. Reynolds opened his mouth but hesitated, looking down at his notes. The answer was obvious, and Vance knew it. I'll take that as a no, Vance said, shaking his head. You're in charge of an agency responsible for millions of lives, and yet instead of focusing on air traffic control shortages, outdated FAA systems, or pilot training, you're fixated on woke terminology. Reynolds' face reddened. Vice President, I assure you, we are focused on safety. Vance raised a document. Really? Because here's a 70-page internal memo from the FAA under Biden's administration outlining how gender-neutral language must be prioritized. I don't see a 70-page memo on improving pilot proficiency or modernizing air traffic control towers. Murmurs of agreement spread through the chamber. Vance's eyes locked onto Reynolds, unwavering. Tell me, Administrator, how many near misses have occurred in American airspace this year? Reynolds swallowed. The number fluctuates, budding. How many? Vance pressed. Reynolds sighed. There have been over 300 serious near misses in the past year. Gasps filled the room. Even some of the Democratic senators shifted in their seats. Vance leaned back, satisfied. And yet, you've spent your time erasing words rather than preventing disasters. The American people deserve better. The tension in the chamber had reached a boiling point. Reynolds' aides shuffled through papers, desperate to find a counterargument. But Vance wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. Vice President J.D. Vance flipped through his notes with deliberate slowness, the weight of his words hanging over the chamber like a thundercloud. The audience, journalists, lawmakers, and spectators sat on the edge of their seats waiting for the next strike. Administrator Reynolds, Vance resumed, his voice steady and cutting, let's not sugarcoat the issue. While you've been busy policing words, the FAA under the Biden administration has presided over the worst aviation safety record in decades. Reynolds straightened his posture, attempting to project confidence. Mr. Vice President, I take exception to that characterization. We've implemented cutting-edge policies to improve the aviation environment. Cutting edge? Vance scoffed, tapping a document. I have a report here from the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, showing that near-miss incidents are up 38% since your office adopted these so-called progressive initiatives. Care to explain how inclusive language prevents a collision at 35,000 feet? A murmur rippled through the crowd. Reynolds' face tightened as he gripped the microphone. Vice President Vance, our policies are about inclusivity and modernity. We believe creating a welcoming environment attracts the best talent. Talent? Vance interrupted, leaning forward with a cold, calculating stare. Would you rather have a pilot who can recite your inclusive glossary or one who can safely land a plane during an engine failure? Reynolds opened his mouth to answer, but Vance pressed on. Let's not pretend this is about safety. This is about ideology, and the American people are sick of it. They want planes that stay in the sky, not bureaucrats wasting taxpayer dollars on linguistic gymnastics. The room echoed with murmured approval. Even a few senators on the other side of the aisle seemed to acknowledge the point. Vance didn't let up. Let me remind you, 4 runway incursions in major airports over the last 6 months nearly led to catastrophic disasters. Yet here we are, talking about whether the word airman is offensive. Where's your sense of priority? Reynolds exhaled sharply. Safety is our highest priority, and we have teams working around the clock to address systemic issues. Really? Vance raised an eyebrow. Then why did your office spend $2.3 million on a language inclusivity task force instead of upgrading outdated air traffic control systems? He shook his head. If I had to choose between a controller who calls it a cockpit and one who can prevent a mid-air collision, I know where my money's going. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, the cracks in his composure showing. We are addressing infrastructure improvements as well. Not fast enough. Vance cut in. You know what the average American traveler cares about? Getting home to their family in one piece. Not whether their pilot uses the term flight deck instead of cockpit. The words hung heavy in the air, a damning indictment of the FAA's misplaced priorities. One of Reynolds' aides scribbled a note and slid it toward him. He read it quickly before addressing Vance again. Vice President, while your concerns are noted, this administration believes that language shapes perception. By fostering a more inclusive environment, we widen the pool of future aviation professionals. Vance smirked. You mean you think words matter more than action? Typical. Under the previous administration, we focused on results, streamlining safety protocols, increasing hiring for air traffic controllers, and accelerating infrastructure projects. What's your administration doing? Making sure no one's feelings get hurt. A wave of laughter rippled through the chamber. Reynolds' face darkened as Vance drove the point home. And let me remind you, Vance continued, his tone sharp, it was the Trump administration that cut through bureaucratic red tape to modernize the FAA software and increase air traffic controller recruitment. Yet, under your leadership, we've had more near misses and chaotic airport incidents. Maybe instead of word games, you should focus on keeping the skies safe. For a brief moment, Reynolds was speechless. His carefully prepared talking points crumbled under the weight of cold, hard facts. The audience knew it, and so did Vance. He leaned back in his chair, his message unmistakably clear. Americans want safety, not woke rhetoric. And if the FAA couldn't deliver, the Trump-Vance administration would. Vice President J.D. Vance let the silence settle for a moment, allowing the weight of his last statement to hang in the air. Across from him, FAA Administrator Michael Reynolds shuffled his papers, searching for a lifeline. But the room was against him now. Even the mainstream media reporters, usually quick to defend the Biden administration's policies, couldn't deny that Vance had landed a devastating blow. Vance tapped his pen on the table, his voice calm but cutting. Let's talk about priorities, Administrator Reynolds. You claim the FAA is committed to safety, but here's what your office has actually been focused on. He held up another document, a thick, spiral-bound report. The gold letters on the cover gleamed beneath the bright chamber lights. This is the FAA's 2024 Equity and Inclusion Strategy, all 312 pages of it. In this report, your office outlines goals like deconstructing systemic biases and embedding gender-expansive terminology into aviation manuals. Vance flipped through the pages with exaggerated care. I'm still looking for the chapter on how to prevent airplanes from crashing. Maybe you can help me find it. A ripple of laughter rolled through the chamber. Reynolds' lips thinned into a tight line. Vice President Vance, as I've already explained, fostering an inclusive environment. Vance cut him off. I'm asking about safety, sir. You oversee a system where nearly 3 million people fly every single day. Last year, there were 46 serious runway incursions, close calls that could have turned into full-blown disasters. Yet, instead of fixing outdated radar systems, you've been busy removing words like man-made because they're exclusionary. Reynolds adjusted his microphone, but his voice faltered. We are working on infrastructure upgrades, but cultural improvements are also vital. Vital to whom? Vance shot back, his voice rising just enough to drive the point home. Certainly not to the passenger praying their flight doesn't collide with another plane on the tarmac. And certainly not to the pilots trying to navigate a broken air traffic control system while you play language police. Vance flipped to another page. Here's a line from your report. Phasing out gendered phrases to foster a more equitable skies experience. Is this what you call progress? Because the people I talk to care a whole lot more about landing safely than whether their captain says, ladies and gentlemen, or not. Reynolds sighed. The aviation community is changing. We're adapting to a broader, more inclusive workforce. Cut the buzzwords, Vance snapped, leaning forward. Is there one shred of evidence that your inclusive language policy has made the skies safer? The room was so quiet that you could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. Reynolds hesitated too long. I'll answer for you, Vance continued, not missing a beat. No. You can't point to a single statistical improvement in safety due to these language changes. But what you can point to is rising pilot shortages, outdated systems, and a spike in near misses. What's next? Replacing Mayday? Because it's not inclusive enough. The chamber erupted in laughter, but Vance's expression was deadly serious. He glanced at his fellow senators. Some were scribbling notes. Others simply watched in stunned silence. Even the Democratic members who had come prepared to defend the FAA's policies looked uneasy. Let me paint you a picture, Administrator Reynolds, Vance said, his voice lowering as he adopted a tone of restrained fury. An American family boards a plane. A mother, a father, 2 kids. They trust that every system, every pilot, every controller is focused on one thing: getting them home safely. But under your leadership, they have to wonder if the people in charge are more worried about being woke than being right. Reynolds, clearly struggling to keep his composure, adjusted his glasses and tried again. Vice President Vance, while I understand your concerns, these initiatives are designed to ensure that everyone, regardless of background, feels welcome in the aviation community. Vance shook his head in disbelief. This isn't a social experiment, sir. It's aviation where the cost of failure is measured in lives lost. You want to play politics? Fine. But don't do it at 35,000 feet. The tension in the room was electric. Vance could feel it. He had struck a nerve. And he wasn't done yet. Vice President J.D. Vance allowed his last words to settle like a heavy fog over the chamber. Across the table, FAA Administrator Michael Reynolds sat stiffly, his fingers interlocked in a white-knuckled grip. But Vance wasn't interested in letting him off the hook. Not yet. Let's get to the heart of the matter, Vance said, his voice now quieter but no less sharp. The American people deserve to know whether their government agencies are focused on competence or compliance with political agendas. So, here's a simple question for you, Administrator Reynolds. Do you believe prioritizing inclusive language makes American air travel safer? Yes or no? Reynolds shifted in his seat, his jaw working as he carefully chose his words. Language reflects culture, and fostering a positive culture encourages better collaboration and... Yes or no? Vance's voice cut like a blade. A tense silence followed. Reynolds opened his mouth but hesitated. The pause was all Vance needed. I'll take that as a no, Vance said, slamming his folder shut. Because the truth is, there is zero empirical evidence that swapping words like airman for aviators prevents mid-air collisions or makes a flight deck any safer. What it does do is waste time and resources while real issues go unaddressed. Vance leaned back, the faintest trace of a smirk on his face. Let's talk about those real issues, shall we? He pulled out another sheet of paper, holding it up for the cameras. The bold headline read, FAA Internal Audit, Critical Failures Identified. This is a report your office quietly released last month, after business hours, I might add, Vance continued, turning the paper for the senators to see. It details over 200 critical vacancies in air traffic control. We're facing the most severe staffing crisis in decades, and yet, instead of recruiting and training the best, you're busy renaming job titles. Reynolds' face had gone pale. We are actively addressing staffing challenges. No, you're not, Vance interrupted, his tone sharper now. The Trump administration laid the groundwork to expand air traffic controller recruitment, but under the Biden team, hiring slowed to a crawl. Meanwhile, overworked controllers are falling asleep on the job, literally, while you're policing language. A sharp murmur spread across the room. Vance let it simmer for a moment before delivering his next blow. Let me remind you of something else, he said, his voice cold. Last year, an American Airlines jet and a Delta flight came within 1,000 feet of a catastrophic collision at JFK Airport. Investigations later revealed that staffing shortages and poor communication contributed to that near miss. But instead of fixing those problems, your focus has been making sure no one says man-made. Reynolds opened his mouth to respond, but Vance wasn't finished. And here's the kicker, he said, pulling out another document. This internal FAA memo, dated 3 months ago, warned that outdated systems could lead to a catastrophic failure during peak travel seasons. But instead of addressing that, you allocated $5 million to equity and inclusion outreach programs. The tension in the room had reached a boiling point. Even members of Reynolds' own party seemed uneasy. Vance let the weight of his words sink in before delivering his final, devastating point. Administrator Reynolds, if your car is speeding toward a cliff, do you care about the language in the owner's manual? Or do you want the brakes to work? Because right now, under your leadership, the FAA is spending more time rewriting the manual than fixing the brakes. And the American people will not forgive this kind of negligence. Reynolds' face was a mask of defeat. The once confident bureaucrat now looked like a man who knew he had lost. Vance didn't let up. The job of the FAA is to keep Americans safe, period. No one cares if you call it a cockpit or a flight deck. They care about getting home in one piece. And until you start focusing on real safety concerns instead of political virtue signaling, you are failing in your duty. The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the clicking of cameras capturing the moment. Vance glanced down at his notes one last time before addressing the entire chamber. The American people expect better. And under our administration, they'll get it. We will not tolerate bureaucrats who put ideology before safety. That stops today. With that, Vance leaned back in his chair, leaving a stunned FAA administrator and a shaken committee in his wake. The hearing was over, but the message was clear. The days of prioritizing woke politics over American lives were numbered. The hearing chamber buzzed with quiet murmurs as Vice President J.D. Vance gathered his notes, the echoes of his final statement still hanging in the air. Across from him, FAA Administrator Michael Reynolds sat rigidly, his face drained of its earlier confidence. The cameras, once focused on the entire room, now zoomed in on Vance, the man who had just delivered a public reckoning. But Vance wasn't done yet. He leaned back toward the microphone, his voice calm but deliberate. One more thing, Administrator Reynolds, he said, his tone measured. I want a full, unredacted report on the FAA's spending over the past 3 years. Every dollar you've funneled toward these ideological initiatives instead of critical safety infrastructure. I want it on my desk by the end of the week. Reynolds swallowed hard and nodded. Understood, Mr. Vice President. The silence that followed was deafening. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the entire room had realized what just happened. Vance had not only dismantled the FAA's woke agenda but also placed the agency on notice. When Vance stood to leave, cameras flashed in rapid succession. Journalists scrambled to get their questions in, but Vance simply adjusted his tie and strode toward the exit. At his side, an aide handed him a phone. Mr. Vice President, the aide murmured. The media is already running with the story. Headlines across major outlets are calling it a takedown of Biden's woke FAA. Vance allowed himself a small smile. Good, he said. Let them. In the media storm, within hours, The hearing became the leading story across every major news network. Conservative outlets celebrated Vance's performance as a masterclass in accountability and leadership, while even traditionally left-leaning networks couldn't ignore the sharp rise in aviation safety concerns under the Biden administration. A banner on one cable news channel read in bold letters, "J.D. Vance exposes FAA's woke priorities? Safety be damned?" Segments played clips of Vance grilling Reynolds about the $2.3 million spent on the FAA's Language Inclusivity Task Force, juxtaposed with real-life footage of near-miss incidents at major airports. Parents of passengers who had narrowly escaped disaster began speaking out, calling Vance's questions long overdue. Political commentators on both sides of the aisle acknowledged that the hearing marked a turning point in the national conversation. One anchor remarked, "It's clear that J.D. Vance is positioning himself not just as vice president, but as a leader willing to take on bureaucratic incompetence at the highest level." The public response. The American people took notice. Social media platforms exploded with clips of the hearing. Hashtags like #FixTheSkies and #NoWokeFAA trended nationwide. Ordinary citizens, whether frequent flyers or not, expressed frustration with an administration they viewed as being more focused on language than lives. A viral post on X, formerly Twitter, summed up the public sentiment. "I don't care if they call it a cockpit or a flight deck. I care about landing safely. Thank you, J.D. Vance, for saying what we've all been thinking." Clapping hands #aviation safety #NoWokeFAA. Memes of Vance asking, "Do you want the brakes to work?" circulated widely, turning his words into a rallying cry. At town halls and on talk radio, callers flooded the lines. Veterans of the aviation industry, many of whom had felt silenced by the push for progressive language, finally had a voice. Former pilots described how safety briefings had grown bogged down by endless discussions on terminology, while vital training programs languished under bureaucratic red tape. And while Biden administration officials scrambled to defend Reynolds, the damage had already been done. The White House scrambles. Behind closed doors, President Donald Trump and his team watched the hearing unfold with satisfaction. At a post-hearing strategy meeting, Trump reportedly quipped, "That's why I chose JD, because he doesn't just talk, he fights." Meanwhile, panic spread through the Biden administration. Anonymous sources leaked to the press that senior officials were furious at Reynolds' lackluster performance. Calls for his resignation began circulating among both political insiders and the public. Facing mounting pressure, the White House was forced to pause several of the FAA's controversial inclusivity programs. In a hastily prepared statement, Press Secretary Rachel Monroe said, "The administration remains committed to both safety and inclusivity, but public trust is paramount." Behind the scenes, however, officials knew the truth. Vance had exposed a vulnerability they couldn't ignore: the legacy of the hearing. In the weeks that followed, the FAA underwent sweeping changes. Under Vance's relentless oversight, Congress passed the Aviation Safety and Accountability Act, prioritizing staffing shortages, infrastructure modernization, and transparent spending. Reynolds, facing bipartisan calls for accountability, quietly resigned, replaced by a veteran aviation expert with a no-nonsense focus on safety first. And J.D. Vance? His national profile soared. Supporters viewed him as a warrior for common sense, someone unafraid to take on bloated bureaucracies. Even skeptics had to admit he had tapped into a deep public frustration with government overreach. Months later, at a packed rally in Ohio, Vance returned to the moment that had defined his leadership. "We stood up and said no to woke nonsense, and yes to protecting American lives," he told the roaring crowd. "And under our administration, that's exactly what we'll keep doing." The cheers were deafening. The message was clear. The era of woke bureaucracies was over, and J.D. Vance had made sure of it.